And we're recording.
Well, welcome everyone. We're going to start our session today. My name is Christina Bain, and I am the director of the Initiative on Human Trafficking and Modern Slavery within the Babson Social Innovation Lab at Babson College in Wellesley, Massachusetts, USA. Thank you for taking the time today to join our conversation, and I want to thank our co-sponsors first and foremost for helping put together this extraordinary panel of speakers in this webinar today. The Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime and the Transnational Crime and Corruption Center at George Mason University. Thank you for your time putting this together. And I want to now introduce the Global Initiative and Livia Wagner, who is going to tell us a bit about their work and a bit about the Global Initiative. Livia?
Hi everyone. Thank you very much for the introduction and for the opportunity to have this webinar together. I'm here with my colleague Giuseppe Reitano. She's also signed in, and I'll just give you just a second the presentation. Okay. Can I go to my presentation, Christina? Yes, there we go. Okay. Hello, everyone again. I'm very happy to introduce the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. I hope that everybody can hear me very well. My name is Livia Wagner, and I'm the private sector advisor of the Global Initiative. And I'm going to give you a short introduction on what the Global Initiative is. I'll just go here. Okay. As you can see, the Global Initiative, there is also our website, is a network of prominent law enforcement, government, and development experts, and from different backgrounds, and we're seeking new and innovative responses to tackle organized crime. The genesis of the Global Initiative is that after closed forum discussions with many experts from different international organizations, governments, or other organizations in the years of 2011 and 2012, participants saw that there is a need of a network of experts. That means to be able to develop a more strategic approach to counter organized crime. The participants furthermore concluded that organized crime and also human trafficking is not systematically integrated in national plans or national action plans, and very often that there is a lack of multilateral cooperation, and there is also a need of a proactive global approach. So meaning that a network of experts could allow a critical debate, but also serve as an incubator for innovative strategies. So yeah, the launch of the Global Initiative was last year in September 2013 in New York, and the network now has more than 100 independent global and regional experts. We're based in Geneva, and we have mainly 3 priority areas of organized crime, which is environmental crime, cybercrime, and organized crime, and human trafficking falls under that. The Global Initiative is very often stakeholders are struggling to counter human trafficking, which also is seen then in the urgency of developing collaborative approaches. And the Global Initiative also developed a research report on smuggling of migrants from Africa to Europe, and it's mainly about the main smuggling routes to Europe, and it's also available on the GI website. The IGAD, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, it's 8-country trade bloc in Eastern Africa. There was a special brief from the GI to that. And the GI also, the aim of the GI is also to include stakeholders from different backgrounds. That means not only from international organizations or civil society organizations, but also very much from the private sector. And today we're talking about this issue, and we think that it's very important to include these stakeholders in the debate to fight human trafficking. So I'm very happy that we have a representative from the private sector, and we're very excited to have this webinar today.
Thank you so much, Livia, for your comments. And if we could move to the next slide. I wanted to just tell you that we have here at Babson College, and one of the reasons why we're doing this webinar series. This is the Initiative on Human Trafficking and Modern Slavery. This is a newer program at Babson, and our goal is to bring together entrepreneurial minds, students and business leaders, corporate, NGO, and governmental partners, and human trafficking and modern slavery activists from across the globe in order to learn, network, and build innovative approaches to advancing human freedom. In addition, we also want to leverage the expertise and resources from Babson's Social Innovation Lab to develop cross-cutting research, classroom approaches, and action-oriented initiatives to educate and activate current and next-generation business leaders in the fight against human trafficking and modern slavery. One of the exciting initiatives we have going on right now is we're working with an NGO, a fantastic NGO named Made by Survivors, to create and work with survivors of human trafficking in Nepal and India with prosperity-based solutions to those who have been rescued so that they have a permanent ability to not be trafficked again. And we're just very excited about this program. And this webinar is part of a series. Some of you may have been on this our previous webinar on October 29th, and our goal with this series is to really highlight the most promising practices in the private sector to fight human trafficking, combined with addressing the most emerging issues within the global fight against trafficking. And today we're going to be focusing particularly on illicit migration, human trafficking, and smuggling in the Americas. And now I have the pleasure of introducing my wonderful colleague and mentor, Dr. Louise Shelley. We could go to the back of the slide.
Okay.
Who is the University Professor and Director of the Terrorism, Transnational Crime, and Corruption Center at George Mason University, who is our co-sponsor today, one of our co-sponsors. And Dr. Shelley is a leading expert on the relationship among terrorism, organized crime, and corruption, as well as human trafficking, transnational crime, and terrorism, with a particular focus on the Soviet Union. She also specializes in illicit financial flows and money laundering. Her most recent book, Dirty Entanglements, Corruption, Crime, and Terrorism, has been published by Cambridge University Press this year. We're very excited for her. This is a fantastic book. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. She's also authored Human Trafficking, A Global Perspective, which was published in 2010, Policing Soviet Society, Lawyers in Soviet Work Life, and Crime and Modernization, as well as numerous articles and book chapters on all aspects of transnational crime and corruption. She is also an editor with Sally Stalker of Human Traffic and Transnational Crime, Eurasian and American Perspectives. In addition, she's also served on the Global Agenda Council on Illicit Trade and Organized Crime for the World Economic Forum, and was the first co-chair of its Council on Organized Crime. She presently co-chairs a group on human trafficking within the Global Agenda Council of the World Economic Forum, and this is a task force that we actually chair together. So I'm very excited to introduce Dr. Shelley as our first presenter today. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm delighted to be doing this. Unfortunately, for the rest of you, Adam Blackwell had to pull out. And so I have stepped in to talk about this, to talk about a comparison of the U.S. and European situation, and I'm sure many of you will have comments on this. Can we get my slides up? Yeah. Christina fixed them up nicely, put in some color. So we're dealing in both the European and the American space with enormous growths of human trafficking and smuggling. In Europe, we have an attraction of generous welfare support and, in the past, and perceived economic advantages, as well as demand in Western Europe for 3D workers, that is, those willing to take on dirty, dangerous, or degrading jobs that citizens of Europe are unwilling to do. And I wrote a lengthy piece on this for the Migration Policy Institute, which appeared about a year ago on the situation in Europe. I know at the moment that there are some serious studies being planned within the European Union community to start in the early new year, and I think these are long overdue, because the problems of illegal migration are severely exasperated since the conflicts in Syria, Iraq, and the serious problems of the failures of the Arab Spring in North Africa. So that we're having large numbers of individuals being illegal migrants, some of them trying to qualify for refugee status, some of them just trying to find a way to survive. And these refugee flows are not arriving, or immigration flows are not arriving in a distributed way throughout Western Europe. There are clusters in Italy. There have been problems of the Italian state trying to move these migrants out of Italy. There's community in northern France near Calais where there are thousands of illegal migrants who are trying to get to the UK. So we're looking at a problem that in 2008, there was an estimated almost 2 million to 4 million unauthorized migrants in Europe, and the problem has really exacerbated in the previous 6 to 8 months. There are great efforts to restrict migrants. As many of you know, there are drowning of migrants and turning them away. Yet at the same time, there are a rise of sophisticated smuggling networks. And as I mentioned to you, there are also holding camps in islands off of Italy that are, not representative of what you want, or not characteristic of what you would want to see in a democratic Europe. The difference between European society and American society is very stark in two ways. First of all, the U.S. is a country of migrants, so even though there is a rise of an anti-migrant and illegal migrant movement in the United States, it's not as if the U.S. has its national identity existing based on language, culture, or history. It's a country of migrants, and there's the American myth of, social advancement of the successful migrant. So that's one very important difference. And the United States is not a social welfare state like much of Western Europe, and so there are many fewer benefits for migrants. It's sort of sink or swim when you get to the U.S., and there are approximately 10 million illegal migrants in the U.S. at the moment. In fact, we've had recently an acceleration of illegal migration as President Obama has talked about amnesties. Crime groups in Central America and elsewhere are exploiting this to promote more business, to smuggle individuals to the United States, suggesting that once in, they'll be able to stay. So we have a situation that is ongoing. It is not static, and it is one of the most contentious political debates in the United States over what to do with the large number of illegal migrants who are present in the U.S. In in contrast with parts of Europe where there's a lot of media attention to this, but not so much policy discussion. There's a lot of policy discussion in the U.S., but not much action. And it is something that is leading very much to, like in Europe, of a second or third tier population that is being exploited for their labor and has sort of no futures within the society. So I want to have some discussion on how we see this problem and what, are there things that we can learn from each other and learn from others on how we can address these issues. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shelley, for those wonderful comments. And I just want to send a reminder to the audience that at any point during any of these presentations, if you could share any questions within the chat box, you'll see that at the bottom of your screen on the right-hand side. Those in and send them to all the panelists. If you click on the bottom, you'll see on the furthest bottom point, there's a menu there, and if you click on all the panelists, we will get your questions. So please send those in so we'll have them ready for our discussion after our last presenter concludes. And if you have any technical difficulties, please email us at the host address, and we'll help you send those questions in. Thank you again, Dr. Shelley, and for those to let you know that Adam Blackwell was not able to join us today. He had something urgent come up, and he deeply apologizes. So thank you, Dr. Shelley, for filling in and serving both as a co-moderator and as a presenter. So now I want to introduce Sarah Stefanski, who is the Sustainability Manager for Safeway USA. And Sarah has been with Safeway for the past 2.5 years, working as a Sustainability Manager in supply chain issues. Her work is focused on quantifying and reporting on environmental metrics for Safeway's private label branded products, developing and implementing sourcing policy for various commodities such as palm oil and paper. And she also leads the Human Trafficking and Forced Mitigation Initiative for the company. She also holds a bachelor's degree in environmental science and a master's degree in sustainability management from Columbia University. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us today as our private sector representative, and we're looking forward to your presentation. Sarah?
Thank you, Christina, and thanks for having me. I'm really happy to be part of the discussion, and I'm glad that people are interested in some of the work so far at Safeway that we've been doing regarding our human trafficking and forced labor risk mitigation efforts. The efforts at Safeway are also a learning process, so I'm always glad to hear what others are doing to help identify and solve these issues. So thanks for the opportunity. I'm going to jump right in. So SB 657, Senate Bill 657. In 2010, California enacted the Transparency in Supply Chains Act, also known as SB 657. The law requires that companies that have annual gross worldwide receipts in excess of $100 million and annual sales in California over $500,000 annually to disclose their efforts to eliminate slavery and human trafficking from their supply chains. The law went into effect January 2012, and I just want to point out here that I think legislation like this is pretty important. Naturally, at Safeway and other retailers, clauses are written into contracts and code of conduct that help protect against violations of labor laws and point out requirements for fair wages and good working conditions. But without this law, I'm not sure large companies would have been so compelled to take action on issues like forced labor or human trafficking in their supply chains. I just want to point out that legislation definitely takes a role here in the U.S. A lot of people that I run into in the United States don't really know where or how to look for situations that could involve human trafficking and forced labor. Many people view it as a distant issue that happens in faraway places, which have minimal human rights laws. places where the standard of living might be very low or people live in extreme poverty, and that is partially true. You hear about plenty of instances that come up in places like Thailand, India, Bangladesh, various African countries, but that's not always the case. Human trafficking occurs right here in the United States in many different industries. Agriculture, an industry that Safeway relies on heavily to do business, is highly susceptible to human trafficking and forced labor risk. California in particular grows a large portion of the country's food, and that's where Safeway is based, and we source a lot of our produce and fruits from California. We have seasonality, meaning labor required to grow and harvest this food fluctuates throughout the year. And we need that food available not only consistently, but cheaply. You can drive around California and see people working in fields pretty much year-round. So we definitely have high demand for constant food supply on our shelves. Because Safeway is so dependent on agriculture and the overall food industry, we by default are dependent on the people who provide us with that food. And as a business that strives to be the most ethical and fair we can be, we want to protect the trust given to us by our consumers, we want to build strong relationships with our suppliers, and we want to operate in an environment of transparency and traceability. By mapping our supply chain and improving transparency and traceability, we not only get the benefit of knowing where our products come from, but we have a better handle on other things like food safety, environmental impact, and the human labor that goes into producing our products. So what did Safeway do about this SB 657 back in 2012? As early as 2011, Safeway decided to be proactive in supporting and complying with the law by working with experts in the human trafficking prevention field. We worked with the UN Global Initiative to Fight Trafficking and an NGO called End Human Trafficking Now to understand the issue. From the UN, we acquired an online education tool for our employees, and we also put together a survey to send to our suppliers regarding their efforts to address human trafficking. We then mandated that all Safeway suppliers respond to the survey that we created, and we required all employees in supply chains to take the online education course. The end goal of all this initial work and collaboration was to give us a better understanding of these issues so we would be able to work with suppliers to identify and eliminate these risks from our common supply chain. We also wanted our own employees trained and aware of the issues. But we also didn't want to stop at just surveying and employee education. We really wanted to do something meaningful with the data we were collecting from suppliers, and not just identify the at-risk suppliers, but really put ourselves in a position to do something about it. So in November of 2013, we collaborated with a consultancy called End Context, which looked at all of our survey responses and ranked about 1,500 of them according to their potential risk of human trafficking and forced labor. It was based on factors like the product, ingredients, region of manufacture, the source region, and any publicly available information in the company and known risks of the company. Here you can see a map that In Context provided us, which has each country highlighted based on human trafficking risks according to their country's policies and documented instances. On the right, we also have each country also. So this is really a helpful resource, more detail in the final report that provided. The analysis through a third party had various functions. We were better able to understand our risk by country and by products produced in those countries, as seen in the maps and the product list in the previous slide. And this is valuable because with about 40,000 different types of products in our stores, our sourcing areas reach across scores of states and countries. The identification of potential high-risk suppliers helped us identify where the most risk might be and engage with those individual suppliers rather than a large group. So for example, instead of engaging with all pomegranate suppliers, we were able to then look at the one or two or three or however many that might show a higher risk of human trafficking. We were also able to establish a methodology for scoring, which can be used to process all future Safeway supplier surveys. So each supplier's risk level was based on a score 0 to 10, 10 being high risk. And those scores were weighted. 75% were the rates of actual occurrence of slavery in the region or country that they do business, and percent in that country or region. 5% is for the product scope. So what's the product? What are the ingredients? How complex is the product? Is it the product? Is it a raw fruit or vegetable? And how many layers it has? As part of this risk analysis, we also did a deep dive on 5 individual suppliers that Safeway chose. Some of these suppliers were large, some were small, and all 5 covered different categories. We use these as examples for NCOG to go into the analysis of each of them. And this deep dive involves me personally communicating with each supplier to get more information like manufacturing addresses, sourcing locations, and ingredients lists. This was a long and difficult process. Suppliers can be a little bit nervous about sharing some of that information, but gathering that information gave us a lot more data to conduct more thorough analyses. As a result of that deep dive, some of those 5 suppliers' scores changed, some for better, some for worse, and this had to do with the location information, the complexity of the product, or the complexity of the company itself, and the ingredients involved in the product that we might not have known before. And it was a good lesson as to why detailed information is important, specifically location and geographic data. This helps us realize that we need to make some changes to our survey itself and start asking these more detailed questions. So some of the key challenges that we faced with this exercise, supplier non-response. As I mentioned, some suppliers are skeptical and a little nervous to share this type of information. It is a sensitive subject, so suppliers don't want to be looked upon negatively if they don't answer in the most ideal way. Small supplier turnover. Suppliers are changing all the time for Safeway. Some are coming on board, some are being discontinued, and this makes it difficult to keep up with current company information. We were really surprised by our lack of visibility past our Tier 1 or first level suppliers. In some cases, we know our Tier 2, so our supplier's supplier, but that's not the norm. This is absolutely something Safeway is planning to work on improving. It makes any type of risk analysis pretty superficial and ineffective if you don't have any visibility into your supply chain. Our original survey also didn't ask for enough quantitative data. We didn't ask all the right questions. The first survey was put together to be as simple as possible for the supplier and meet our compliance responsibilities, but we weren't exactly sure what we wanted to do with the information or how detailed we needed it to be. So it was a learning process. So what we did in 2014 to start improving from our learning was we revised our survey to ask better questions. We developed a mitigation plan for those high-risk suppliers that were identified through the analysis effort. And just last week, we released a guidebook called Supply Chain Accountability, Eliminating Human Trafficking and Forced Labor. And this is meant to communicate our understanding of and commitment to eliminating human trafficking from our supply chain. It was written for our employees and our suppliers, but it is publicly available on our website for anyone to take a look at and download. And for 2015 and beyond, we've got a lot on our plate. Our e-learning course, which is the online education tool for our employees, we would like to make publicly available for all of our suppliers to use and pass on to their own suppliers and their own supply chains. The end goal is to get everyone in the supply chain educated all the way down to the farm level, educated on their rights, educated on the issue of human trafficking and forced labor. We think that's a crucial first step to fixing these types of issues. We also are going to continually monitor the responses that come in and do an annual deeper analysis with a third party, once again. And we also are going to engage those non-compliant or high-risk suppliers with our new mitigation plan. And the collaborative efforts, we think, are pretty important. We want to continue those collaborative efforts with all types of organizations. We believe that these topics of human trafficking, forced labor, and being able to address those issues is going to take the cooperation of all companies across all industries. I do believe that legislation is important here and has a big role to play. And as a consumer, I think that consumers' purchasing decisions are pretty powerful. But for a consumer to make a responsible decision, they need to be aware and educated on the topic. So more education for our consumers as well is on the table for next year. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for that outstanding presentation. And just as another reminder, just wanted to let you know if you could send in any questions that you have about any of these great presentations, just send it to the chat box at the bottom right-hand side of your screen, and we will use those to begin our discussion after our last presenter. And now I have the opportunity to introduce our final presenter today, Alejandra Anchieta, the founder and executive director of Prodesk Mexico. And Alejandra is a Mexican lawyer and activist who is leading the fight for the rights of migrants, workers, and indigenous communities of her native country to dramatically raise their standard of living. Since founding Prodesk in 2005, Alejandra and her dedicated team have run strategic campaigns aimed at protecting the economic, social, and cultural rights of Mexico's most marginalized people. The tangible results of these campaigns include unprecedented accountability mechanisms between some of the world's largest transnational companies, thereby ensuring the rights to dignified housing, health, education, and a fair wage, among others. Alejandra is the laureate of the 2014 Martin Ennals Award, and we welcome her here today. Thank you so much, Alejandra, and I'll leave it to you.
Thank you so much to everybody to give me this opportunity to share with you today. And I would like to start thanking to the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime and the Babson College and Terrorism, Transnational Crime and Corruption Center for inviting me to participate. As already I was presented, my name is Alejandra Anchieta, and I am the founder and the executive director of Mexican human rights organization called El Proyecto de Derechos Económicos, Sociales y Culturales, the Project of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, Prodesk. And before founding Prodesk, I worked as a human rights lawyer in several human rights organizations in Mexico, where I gained experience in strategic litigation. However, I would like to focus more on my experience on the topic recruiting and hiring Mexican migrant workers under the scheme of temporary visas H2. The scheme of migrant workers under temporary permissions has increased around the world because it has represented a successful model to respond to the lack of jobs in undeveloped countries, and also the necessity of cheap labor in the developed economies. On the other hand, these temporary migrant programs have been used to control and regulate migration flows in a context where geographical, historical, economic, and social reasons have justified the implementation of control and limitation. In any case, the protection and respect of workers' human rights has remained in second place despite many international conventions and treaties that have established standards of protection. Even when some countries have attempted to include these standards, the effectiveness in the implementation is still being a challenge. Since 2012, the Project of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights has documented violations in the labor human rights of migrant workers of Sinaloa.
No, that's me.
This region in Mexico is a...
Gali is asking me to move the PowerPoint, or asking me to make her the presenter to move the PowerPoint, I guess.
It is a source. Do you need to do you have any questions for me before I continue with the presentation?
No, Alejandra, do you have the presentation up on your screen? If you can just manage moving the slides on your screen there at the top, the arrows left and right will be able to control that for you.
I will start to do this. So I was just well, I was talking about the work that we are doing on the state of Sinaloa, where we documented violation of the labor human rights of migrant workers. This region in Mexico is a source of thousands of temporary workers that every year participates in the seafood industry of Louisiana and on the United States. Workers who travel under temporary migrant visa program experience many violations to their human rights. These schemes have not contributed to stop illicit migration because they haven't had a high regard for the protection, respect, guarantee, and promotion of human rights. Especially the recruitment procedures have a direct impact on the working conditions of temporary workers, and those practices depend on the design of temporary immigration programs per se. Therefore, it is essential to give emphasis to this process principally because from the recognition of their labor status derive another rights such as Social Security for immigrant workers, among others. Visas H-2 is an unilateral temporary immigration program of the United States for persons who want to enter the United States for employment lasting a fixed period of time and are not considered permanent or indefinite. There are two categories, H-2A for temporary agricultural workers and H-2B for temporary non-agricultural workers, mostly services. The Mexican government should verify the conditions under the workers are recruited and hired to work abroad. However, the government doesn't participate in that process to ensure that the workers' rights are respected. Workers who travel under the H-2 temporary visa program are usually recruited by agents of private recruiting companies in their countries of origin. This procedure contributes to the violations of migrant workers' rights due to the lack of control, inspection, regulation, and trafficking of the employment incident. There is no guarantee, protection, or negotiation from the state to ensure that Mexican workers avoid potential risk. The only actor participating in these temporary immigration programs is the American government, and they set the conditions from a perspective of cheap labor and clear position of disadvantage for the Mexican workers. We have monitored the existence of regulation between the recruitment agencies and the United States employers. This situation opens a chance for ambiguous conditions during the employment processes. In some cases, employers pay an amount of money for the agency's services. In other cases, the recruitment agencies set arbitrary fees for the migrant on a promise to assure a workplace. The absence of regulation, attention, and supervision from the Mexican authorities place the temporary workers in a situation of extreme vulnerability. This enables the violations of labor human rights and blocks the access to effective justice mechanisms, expanding the situation of impunity where the recruiters operate with a minimum of or even no responsibility for the employer. As a result, the system H-2 as an alternative to undocumented migration does not guarantee a full respect and protection of migrant workers. In our experience and documentary work in progress, we have identified the following violations. Recruitment fees. Our research in Sinaloa has revealed that workers pay between $40 to $540 US to obtain a temporary visa. To pay these illegal fees, workers often have to take out high interest loans. These charges violate the right of labor, and on the other hand, these situations support the control of intermediary agencies. The payment of fees for the recruitment service is a common violation of the temporary workers' rights, and is a result of the lack of regulation and oversight in the hiring process. The second violation that we documented, it is the fraud during the recruitment process. We have documented in the northern region of Sinaloa in Mexico at least 2 cases of fraud caused by recruiters that offer visas to workers in exchange of money. In these cases are involved at least 50 workers, and the Mexican law stipulates that fraud is a crime punishable under the criminal laws of various states of the country. The third violation are threats and extortion. Threats and extortion are common crimes committed against workers who aspire to a temporary visa. Recruiters have a full control over the hiring process, forcing the workers to give up under the pressure to maintain their work in this environment of impunity and hostility. Even another offenses take place without any difficulties, such as human trafficking or forced labor. The other violation, it is discrimination. Discrimination is any distinction, exclusion, or restriction based on ethnic or national origin, gender, age, disability, social or economic status, health, pregnancy, language, religion, opinions, marital status, or any other that block or nullify the recognition or exercise of rights and equality for opportunities for people. The temporary workers are constantly discriminated by recruiters and employers. A very common practice is the blacklisting and retaliation against workers who show any sign of disattention or who stand up for their rights. Commonly, they are not called again to work on the following seasons. And the fifth one, it is the violation on human trafficking and forced labor. The conditions of recruitment and employment may incur in a scheme of trafficking and forced labor. The International Labor Organization recognized that migrant workers and indigenous people are particularly vulnerable to forced labor. This practice can result from internal or across-border movements, which renders some workers particularly vulnerable to deceptive recruitment and coercive labor practices. The permission delegated to recruitment agencies enable the movement of people to another country for labor exploitation purposes through promises of working conditions that are not real. When the temporary workers have a visa, the governments never supervise or monitor the hiring process because they assume that their rights are safeguarded. However, PRODES has documented cases where the workers are forced to do different duties to those they were hired for or employees without payment. In other cases, they retain their passports, and some others are locked in the workplace or at their homes to ensure that the workers finish the labor time set in the visa, although they are not working or living in proper conditions. In recent years, the United States has identified the debate about migration, especially on the illegal matters. Their efforts intend to regulate nearly 11.7 million undocumented immigrants that live and work in the country, and temporary permissions programs have been presented as a real option to end with the problem of illegal migration and human rights violations. As an example, the 2013 immigration reform includes the option of documentation with the creation of a new type of visa, the W visa, which would extend the visa system for non-agricultural workers to 200,000. Now the limit is 66,000 per year. The workers with visa W eventually qualify to apply for permanent residence based on merit, and they could also switch to another registered company. Dependents of W visa holders could also join and have permission to work. Temporary work programs, it is a trend in practice worldwide as an alternative to migration control. So it is essential to create mechanisms oriented to protect, promote, and respect temporary workers' human rights. Documented migration could represent a solution against illegal migration as long as there are real mechanisms that respect their rights. Otherwise, the risk of undocumented migration could rise. To ensure effectiveness in the design and introduction of temporary work programs is necessary the participation of the migrant workers. Only with their contribution is possible to achieve real cooperation and ensure the respect of fundamental rights. In this sense, the respect of the right of association and collective bargaining is the basis to start the construction for better conditions. Thus, in 2013, PRODES accompanied the creation of the Coalition of Temporary Workers of Sinaloa, unique in their type because it was constituted in the country of origin, Mexico, and they have highlighted the responsibility of the authorities in the process of recruiting and hiring. Only organized workers can contribute to change and improve the labor circumstances. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Alejandra, for your wonderful presentation and perspective, and for all the great work that you're doing in Mexico. And I want to just mention that we will be having these PowerPoints posted, and we'll be sending you a recording out to all the participants and those who could not be here with us today. So you will be having these PowerPoints to look over again. In addition, we're going to be compiling a resources page with some of the websites and references that have been made in the presentation, so you also have that as well, and that will be included in the recording link that we will send out. And now I want to introduce Dr. Louise Shelley, who is going to moderate our discussion. If you could continue to send in your questions to the chat box. Don't send them in, if possible, to the Q&A box. I know that's slightly confusing. It's just easier to use the chat box and have it all in one place. I see a couple of you have sent in some questions already, so just continue to send those into the chat box only on the bottom right-hand part of your screen. Thank you so much. Dr. Shelley?
I'd like to start, can you hear me? With a question for Alejandra. I know that you are working in Sinaloa, which also has a very serious organized crime problem. Do you find that the individuals who were recruiting are connected to organized crime, or are they forced to share some of the recruitment fees with them? And how does their presence complicate your work to try and work on behalf of labor rights?
Thank you so much for the question. I think it is a pretty important question because, as you probably all know, the organized crime has a presence in the entire country, and Sinaloa is one of the states where the presence of the organized crime, it is more visible than in other states. And in the work that we are doing, helping workers and also giving them information to have more tools to defend themselves from recruiters, we until now we do not have any experience with recruiters that are part of the network of the organized crime. But we do know that the work that we are doing, underlining the system of these recruiters and the corruption that it is fostering also the violations to the human rights of the workers, will be bringing attention to the other networks that are working on the field, and some of the networks are part of the organized crime. So we are pretty aware that our work could be threat by some people of the organized crime. We are taking care about the work that we are doing, and also taking care of the organizing processes that we are giving legal advice with the workers on their communities, and we are trying to avoid any kind of confrontation with these groups of the organized crime, but we believe in some extent we can touch their interests. So we need to keep doing the work that we are doing, trying to do in a pretty responsible way, but we also know that the best way to face not only the violations of labor rights of these temporary workers, but also improving the human rights situation in the entire country, it is organizing in the communities and giving to the communities and giving to the workers the enough information about their rights and how to defend and demand their rights.
Thank you. Are there some other questions that are out there for Alejandra or some of our other speakers? I'll continue then if we don't have some, but I hope you'll step in. Sarah, in your work, are you finding that your competitors are beginning to follow into a more aggressive approach towards supply chain management, or are you still far ahead of others, and does that make it more difficult for you?
I do find that we're a little bit ahead of our competitors. You know, sometimes these policies are written into the contracts or the company's code of conduct, so we wouldn't always be able to see what their wording is. I'm sure if any company doing business in the United States these days doesn't have wording that protects against labor violations, that would be a big problem for them. So I'm sure the wording is in there as far as doing a supply, and all companies doing business in California do have to comply to SB 657. So they do on some level have to engage. As far as serving all of their suppliers and doing the deeper analyses that we've done and writing the guidebook that we've recently published, I haven't seen our direct competitors doing anything like that, but hopefully with more discussion and more awareness of the issue, that will change in the future.
All right, let's hear it from the audience. There are 33 attendees, and I don't want to be monopolizing the questioning.
Please, we actually have a few questions in the chat box as well. So I don't know if you have that open on your screen, but there appears to be one from David. I also have one from one of our attendees who is on the phone. So if it's all right, I'll unmute her and she can ask her question now.
Okay.
All right, Ness, I believe you're good.
Hi, this is Ness Parker with Deloitte Consulting. Have I successfully come off mute?
Yep, we can hear you.
Fantastic. Great. Thanks, you guys. And thank you for organizing this webinar. It's been absolutely fantastic. A question, I guess, largely for the colleague from Safeway as well as Professor Shelley, related to legislation that we're seeing largely right now in the UK related to the modern slavery bill.
Slow down a little bit. Slow down.
Sure.
So English is not everyone's native language.
Of course. I'm curious about the ramifications and implications of legislation in the United Kingdom, particularly the modern slavery bill, which in a way is essentially an extension of the California Supply Chain Transparency Act. I'm curious, I believe Safeway has subsidiaries that are in the United Kingdom, so curious to hear how you all are preparing for that legislation with the potential for monitoring and evaluation and potentially certifications around supply chain resiliency and due diligence. So that's the question for Safeway. And the follow-on, Professor Shelley, is curious to hear, because you had mentioned some of the migration sort of trends that you're seeing in Europe, and curious to hear your point of view on how legislation might impact those populations.
That's for me. Is there someone else that you wanted to address?
Sure, the first one was for Safeway.
Yeah, I got the first part. So thanks for the question. We do not have any subsidiaries in the UK. We only do business in the United States, but I am glad to hear that something similar to SB 657 is popping up in other places. That's encouraging.
I would say in the United States, there is certainly legislation about guest worker programs and issues of illegal migration, and there is now, as somebody pointed out, the Department of Labor has developed a toolkit to help businesses combat the risks of child labor and forced labor. And there's also something known as the Blue Campaign that is going on in the United States in relationship to labor trafficking and abuse. I attended one of their launch sessions a few weeks ago in November, and they're trying to explain to people how to implement the existing legislation, because the problem is not just having legislation on the books, which there is a lot of at the moment, but how to get enforcement. And much of our enforcement in the trafficking area has been spent on sex trafficking and not as much on labor trafficking. So there's a push for that these days. There's
Thank you. Oh, Professor Shelley, I was going to ask, do you see similar initiatives like the Blue Campaign with the European Commission and others in Europe?
That I'm not aware of. Maybe someone else can answer that. All right, we have a question for Sarah. Have you gone down the supply chain to the primary commodity level?
That is the ultimate. That is where we have the most difficulty. So we definitely know who our direct suppliers are, and we call those Tier 1 suppliers. Sometimes we know who our Tier 2 suppliers are, which is our supplier's supplier. And in the case of highly processed foods, let's say, things that are prepackaged that you find in the store, they might have 40 different ingredients in one product. All of those ingredients might come from a completely different place. So you run into a situation where one product might have 50 suppliers, for example. We have not been able to get to the farm or plantation level yet. That's the goal. There's a lot of work surrounding that. We've been talking to various technology companies who want to pull in data from the farmers and from the plantation workers, and then all the intermediary people. But it's a lot of work. And then when you start talking about suppliers overseas, they don't always have internet connection. They can't always get to a computer to input their data. So there's a lot of talk around mobile technology and how can we get data and information from those people on the ground who are actually working with our commodities to be able to access and put in data without an internet connection or with just a mobile phone, maybe via SMS or maybe via voice. So there's a lot of talk around it. We haven't seen anything that is effective enough to get to that level yet, but we're definitely working on it.
I have another question for you here. Is Safely familiar with the list of goods produced by child labor or forced labor, and if so, how has this list been used?
Yes, we are familiar with that. It plays into our risk analysis that we did, and it's in our the guidebook that we just released last week. So we're definitely familiar with it. If there's a product that's on that list and we source that product from that particular country, it's automatically high risk. So there's any supplier that's associated in that country with that product is on our high risk list.
Okay. There's a question here for me. Could you talk about pending federal legislation? Could you talk a bit about the collaborative efforts that I am aware of with private industry companies in conjunction with academia and federal, state, and local law enforcement? And where are the greatest needs for improvement, in your opinion? Christina and I have been involved through the WEF of a publication that's just about, or has just been released, on what is going on in cooperation of the private sector and in the anti-trafficking space. And we found some efforts, particularly in hotel or hospitality, transport, tech industry, and financial industry, where there was some excellent cooperation by the private sector with NGOs and with the community. There is certainly not enough going on with academia. That is certainly not part of this. And there is not as much going on with federal, state, and local law enforcement. We're hoping that after the publication of this report, and maybe Christina will add this, and we do a launch in February, that we will get more businesses to come forward and discuss with us what is going on. I know we have Deloitte on the call today, and they learned of this effort recently through a meeting at the Blue Campaign. And so we're hoping that this is the beginning of an effort to document what is out there. But I think that's one of the weakest areas that we've had is the involvement of the business sector. I know there's an effort going on in our Northern Virginia community to where I live, to work between academia, law enforcement, NGOs, and the business community. but there are not many models of this for the groups to follow. All right, we have another question for Safeway and others of what happens once a supplier is placed on the high-risk list.
Good question. So we just put together our mitigation plan, which is the document I mentioned. If they're on the high-risk list, or if they don't answer our survey or are very vague with their answers, we will send a follow-up correspondence. We'll send an official Safeway letter signed by an SVP of supply chain to ask them to remediate the issue. So we're going to ask them either, hey, you guys need to answer the survey, or else we potentially will not do business with you, or you need to provide us some more information to clarify some points. So there's certain questions that will be kind of red flags if they answer a certain way, or if they don't give us enough information. So we'll then ask them to provide us some more information. In severe cases where it looks really strange, we'll ask them for either audits. We might ask them to show some sort of verification that there is no funny business going on. And what that looks like, I'm not quite sure yet, because this is all very new. We just put this mitigation plan out, so we haven't really been able to test it just yet. I do have a list that I'm getting ready to send letters to in the next couple of weeks. So every situation is different as well. So it could be a case where I get responses, I look at them, and it looks really bad. Like everything across the board looks red to me. But it might just be a miscommunication. They might not be understanding the questions. They might not, you know, have the time to answer them thoroughly. So we don't want to jump to conclusions and be like, oh, you guys are terrible, we're not doing business with you anymore. We do want to be able to work with suppliers, build that trusting relationship, and have the two-way communication. Because it's not that they don't care, or they're not interested in the topic, or they're trying to get away with something all the time. But sometimes they just need a bit of a chance to give us further information, or show us an audit, or, you know, have us do a site visit if it comes to that. So there's lots of different options. Each case is unique.
All right, I had a question that came in. Thank you very much for your response, Sarah. I had a question that came in for me, but I think it's also very important for Alejandra. And this is the question of how does these problems of illegal migration mesh with agreements and goals of NAFTA and CAFTA? And I'm sorry that we don't have Adam Blackwell here to talk more on the legal side and the mechanisms. But one of the things I wanted Alejandra to talk about is, is your group also involved with problems of abuses at maquiladores in northern Mexico, which are the factories which are being, you know, set up there to produce with, you know, cheaper labor and take advantage of the NAFTA agreement? Or is your focus primarily on recruitment for the United States?
Well, thank you so much for the question. My organization is principally focused on the recruitment process in Mexico for workers that are going to travel to the United States. But I do think that the mechanisms set for the NAFTA, I think the labor agreement, the bilateral agreement between the United States, Canada, and Mexico, it could be used for some of the violations to the labor rights of these kind of migrant workers. We are trying to develop a complaint using the 11 principles under the labor agreement, that is this human rights agreement, which is also under the NAFTA agreement, to complain about not only the conditions of recruitment in Mexico, but also the conditions of work once the workers are already working at the United States. I mean, it is a pretty interesting mechanism to use in this kind of situation, but the problem that we have in Mexico, it is that any resolution for this kind of mechanism, it is not mandatory for the Mexican government, the U.S. government, or the Canadian government. It is more some sort of recommendation that the mechanism can do to improve the situation of migrant workers. But it is not something that we can make enforceable for the government involved in this cycle of migration.
I just wanted to add something to this, is that when the NAFTA and CAFTA agreements were developed, the primary focus was on free trade. The focus was on how to promote increasing cross-border movement of goods. And the human dimension was not really a central piece of NAFTA or CAFTA. And I think we're living with these consequences of it today, in that you can't have free movement of goods without also freer movement of people. But this was not something that was on the top or even a secondary part of people's minds in these negotiations, as far as I understand from people who are close to this.
Yeah,
right.
You are totally right.
And, you know, they're business people, they're trade people, they're not human rights activists or people with a strong human agenda. That's not their point. And I think we're paying the cost for that today. Just as we didn't think about that the illicit flows would flow, I'm not talking about illicit human flows, but that illicit flows would go along with illicit, we also didn't think about the movement of people and the movements within Mexico also to these maquiladores as well. So let's see what else I have. We have many questions now, so the discussion is proceeding. It's great that people are getting to this. Sarah, what intra-industry efforts, if any, are in your future plans to bring in other companies in your efforts? Do you plan to reach out to others?
I'm always on the lookout for organizations that are experts. To be honest, this is not my field of expertise. I've kind of become the Safeway expert over the last 2 years. So I talk to a lot of NGOs like Verite. We talk to Free the Slaves. In Context as they're part of the Sierra Nevada group, so they've got a lot of data and intelligence on these types of issues. But I'm always also talking to other companies who have these same type of challenges. I always reach out to people. I go to conferences and I try to have the discussion, find out what others are doing, what their level of interest is. This is a particularly hard topic, and it's a little harder than environmental sustainability because it's so clandestine. It's kind of like nobody wants to talk about it, and it's kept hidden a lot of the time. So it's hard to get good data. It's hard to talk to people without making them a little uncomfortable, because then you kind of come off as almost accusing people of having these issues in their supply chain and, selling products that are made on the backs of migrant workers or people who are treated unfairly all over the world. So a lot of people are a little hesitant to talk very openly about it, and I think that's something that we all need to get over in order to fix these problems that do obviously exist in everyone's supply chain. I don't think any industry is immune to it. We need to have the discussion. So part of our efforts are to get more information out there, start educating our suppliers and our own employees on these topics, and try to open up that discussion with as many different organizations as possible.
Thank you. Another question is, do you work with vendors to fix any unfair practices, or do you sever ties? And why has Safeway refused to sign on to the Fair Food program? How can consumers know if they are making purchases from vendors with fair labor practices?
I'm not sure on the specifics on why we have not signed the Fair Food program. What I can say about those types of things is that signing a piece of paper doesn't always get the result or prove that you're taking any action. So you can, and I mean, we've seen this in other cases, countries, organizations, people have signed pieces of paper that say, we will do this and we stand for X, Y, and Z, but then no follow-up. So I am not clear on why we haven't signed that. I can ask and try to find out why, but I don't think that that's a real indication of progress in this field. I think making the statements and then showing the action and showing the steps taken is a much stronger thing to do than just signing something. We would, and we have severed ties with suppliers who do not meet our standards in terms of various things. So if they don't meet our code of conduct, food safety, or labor, social issues, there's been a case that I've seen that we've completely severed ties with a supplier. We will suspend a supplier if there's violations that maybe they're working on fixing, but for the time being, we don't want their product. I've seen that happen. And written in our document that we released last week, it pretty clearly states that if a supplier cannot meet our expectations in terms of eliminating or identifying human trafficking and forced labor in their supply chains, we will take corrective action up to and including termination of our relationship. And of course, I just want to reiterate, we do want to also work with our suppliers if they're working on the problem or if they didn't know there was a problem beforehand and suddenly something comes up that they've just become aware of. You know, you have to kind of give them a chance to fix it. If they don't fix it, then yeah, we're not doing business with you. Or, you know, it's all dependent on the circumstances. How can a consumer know that they're buying products made without forced labor? Speaking as a consumer myself, it's hard. It's tough. I don't know. Try to buy locally. Try to look into your own food supply chain and see where your products are coming from. But until there's some sort of verification, which is going to be pretty tough for anyone to do in the near future, I think it's a challenge we all face.
Thank you. I have a question for Alejandra. You know, when we're hearing about Safeway, this is a large corporation that has large amounts of resources at its disposal for many things, and so it has chosen to dedicate some of them to this sustainability and accountability effort. How do you raise money in this difficult environment to keep your organization going, and where can you find sources of support financially and in services from the community?
Well, as a human rights organization, it is very important for us to have economic support principally for foundations. We are not receiving economic support from any government, including the Mexican government, because we need to keep our autonomy, and we need also to keep our impartiality in the work that we are doing. So we are most of the time asking for funds to international foundations like MacArthur Foundation, Open Society, the Ford Foundations, and even some business foundations, for example, the Levi Strauss Foundation, who are doing, which is a foundation supporting principally work on labor rights. And that is how we are doing the work and looking for support on the economic side, but also on the public opinion side. It is pretty important that businesses recognize the work organizations like Prodesc and other organizations that are trying to improve labor conditions of workers that are working on the fields, for example, in the United States, but they are also part of the supply chain that are giving the products to stores like Walmart or Safeway. So the engagement of these businesses in a more ethical relationship with organizations like Prodesc and other human rights organizations could be a pretty important resource of support for the work that we are doing.
Thank you. I know you listed here that you're receiving money primarily from American-based philanthropists, but there are very wealthy individuals in Mexico. Are you finding any basis of support in foundations in your own country? Are you finding lawyers and others who are ready to offer pro bono services? Can you talk a little bit more about the dynamics within Mexican society?
Of course, it is true that there are, at least we have one of the richest men of the world, which is Carlos Slim here in Mexico, but the Mexican society, it is not pretty engaged with social issues. They are more involved in some projects more directed by an assistentialist point of view, not necessarily in projects that are looking for the exercise of human rights, which is a huge difference here in Mexico. And even we were trying to engage some of these members of the society that has enough economic resource to support the work of human rights organizations. They are not interested in do that kind of work with us. Yeah, I think I lost the second part of your question.
Are you finding people offering pro bono legal services,
yeah.
like lawyers willing to help, or accountants or others that may be not as much part of the elite of Mexico that don't have this interest in their philanthropy, but individuals more of the professional class who may have a little more interest in human rights?
Exactly. Well, principally people from the academia in Mexico, and a lot of private universities here in Mexico are offering their pro bono work to Prodesc and other human rights organizations. That is a source of support that we are always trying to use, and it is also a pretty high-level work that we can use for free. They are pretty committed with organizations of human rights. That is a source of support that it is important for us.
Thank you. It's good to hear that academics are useful for something.
They are.
There's a question here for me. It says both in the and I think Alejandra should help answer this one too. Both in Europe and the Americas, conflict violence-driven migration is mixing with economically motivated migration. What do you see as the impact of this on the migration flow, in particular the role of migrant smugglers, and how does this impact the response framework? I'm going to ask this to Alejandra. As you have many migrants from Central America flowing into Mexico, are you also seeing this as part of the problem you need to be addressing, or are you primarily focusing on recruitment within your own country? And how much do you see this as driven by the violence in Mexico, and how much by the economic problems?
Yeah, well, as you all know, Mexico has this pretty strategic geographic situation that is a country expulsing migrants, but it is also a country where some migrants from Central America are crossing through to go to the United States and sometimes to Canada. And in that regard, we are principally working in the field of Mexican workers going to the United States. We, in some occasions, we are giving legal advice to some Central American migrant workers, but it is not our principal focus. And I would like to also say that at least 150,000 undocumented people enter Mexico each year across the southern border. So it is a huge problem. And they are the principal victims of smugglers and members of the organized crime. That is a huge crisis right now in Mexico, and it is also the responsibility of the Mexican government to take actions to prevent the vulnerability of these migrant workers, not only migrant workers from Mexico going to the United States, but also the Central American migrant workers that are passing through the Mexican territory, because once our Constitution states that every single person that entered to the country have the same rights that all the Mexicans here in Mexico, doesn't it is the legal status. It is not an obstacle to also have the right to walk freely in the territory and to have the right to safety and the right to access to justice. So in that regard, the Mexican government it is also failing to protect not only Mexican migrant workers, but also the workers from Central America that are passing through Mexico.
Thank you. I think Alejandra answered this question very clearly from the American perspective, because some of these immigrants from Central America are moving on to the United States, and that's a combination, their motivation of escaping violence, which is acute, and we've seen that with the almost 40,000 unaccompanied children that came to the United States. That may seem like not a labor or a legal migration issue, but some of those children were placed into exploitative labor situations in transit. So that's an issue, and it's also an economic issue of when you have so much violence as we have in Central America, which is probably the highest rates of violence in the world today, it has a devastating impact on the economy. So it's very hard in this region to tease out the difference between violence and economics. The two are so deeply coupled. I mean, we're talking about rates of violence that have exceeded that of Colombia, that have exceeded that of Karachi, Pakistan, which is known for its extreme violence, and even in many explicit conflict areas. In Europe, there's certainly a very deep problem of migration coming from so many conflict regions. It has absolutely boosted the number of migrants traveling by boat from North Africa, especially as Libya is just imploding at the moment, and also people trying to escape Syria and Iraq and the forces of ISIS. And this is, compounding the already structural problems of economic migration. And I don't think that there has been enough of a coordinated response in Europe. To be rather frank, I've been shocked that I've been approached by so many sort of European organizations that are trying to submit contracts to do this research, that there are not enough Europeans who've been trying to study this problem in some, holistic way, but they've been relying too much, I think, on, official statistics and not the kind of analysis that's needed to help come up with strategies and solutions. But there's some that they're just such problems of people seeking refugee status or need or deserve refugee status that it's quite different from a illegal migration problem. But there are certainly migrant smugglers, as the question was asked, who are capitalizing on both sets of actors. All right, here we have another question on maquiladores. It is known that since NAFTA began and maquiladores opened up on the U.S.-Mexican border, there was an increase of violence around these areas, especially towards women that were recruited to work there. Also, there are areas which are notorious for the bordellos that pop up. When we look at this area, we also need to address the increase of sex trade in these regions. I'm sure that they also recruit from such other Central American countries as Guatemala. Is there a study on these increases? Have the organizations, whether governmental or non-governmental, studied that phenomenon, and how do they act upon it? Alejandra, do you have anything to add on this, or is your primary focus on labor migration?
Yeah, Brodesky is primarily focused on labor migration, but I do know that principally organizations from the state of Chihuahua, which is the border with the United States, and it is also the principal corridor where the maquiladora sector was based. They have a lot of information and documentation regarding all these issues, and principally regarding the violence against women in Ciudad Juarez and in Chihuahua, and the violence against female workers on the maquiladora sector, and how the lack of possibilities to collective organize themselves in unions was also one of the obstacles to face the violence as workers, but also the violence outside of the maquiladoras. Some organizations, for example, like Red Mesa de Mujeres in Ciudad Juarez, they have a pretty important research regarding the conditions of female workers in the maquiladora sector, and also they are doing a pretty interesting analysis about the sex trafficking conditions of women in that sector, in that area, with the lack of guarantees for labor rights of female workers on the maquiladora sector. Also, the academia in Chihuahua and the academia in the UNAM, which is the National University here in Mexico, they have a lot of investigation, of research and investigations regarding this issue that I think will be interesting to understand the complexity of the maquiladora sector and the intersection with the sex trafficking of women in Ciudad Juarez.
Is there some things that you could share for this webinar, even if they're in Spanish and not I don't. Of course, I can send you later the links of the organizations, and also the links of the National University here in Mexico that are doing this kind of research, but I don't have it right now with me. Oh, no, so we don't need it right now. I'm just saying that we can have as that we can have for our community to share, because it's a general resource, and this is very useful, and we have a multilingual community that can read things even if they're not in English.
Wonderful. I can send it to you later.
Because I know one of the last people asking one of these questions is, is bilingual in English and Spanish. So this is wonderful that we have such a broad community. Now to return to Sarah. Someone suggested that maybe it would be worth engaging the Grameen Foundation on trying to get some support in this area. There was a question for Sarah to discuss a little bit more about the process of how Safeway began to fight human trafficking. Was this a top-down effort? Was it generated by the leadership? Was your position created as a result of a senior decision? Were there employees pressing for this, consumers, or was it all of the above? Because this is one of the questions we've been very interested in looking at and presenting in the research that Christina and I have been doing under the auspices of the WEF, is that there's sometimes some leadership that gets the idea that they want to do this, and then sometimes we find enormous efforts from mid-level or just rank employees of a company to do much more. So if you could tell us where Safeway fits into this picture, it would be very helpful for us to understand.
Sure. And thanks for the recommendation of the organization to engage with as well, whoever suggested that. So the effort started a few months before I started working at Safeway. I started in early 2012 in April, and the law passed in January 2012. From what I understand, the people who were involved with it in the very beginning are not at the company anymore. But from what I understand of what happened was they knew the law was going to pass, SB 657, and they said, all right, we need to get a little bit ahead of this, which is typically the case with Safeway. We look out for laws that are going to pass, and California's got a ton of them that are always passing, so we try to get a little bit ahead of it. So they got ahead of it by engaging with these NGOs, trying to understand and learn about the issue. But the driver really came from the top down in our situation. It came from an SVP who saw the opportunity for Safeway to become a leader in it. They kind of assumed that everybody else would just do their due diligence and meet the requirements of the law. And that's sort of what we did at first, but we went a little bit farther with that initial survey. But this particular SVP was saying, okay, we've got an opportunity here to go even farther and be a leader in this area, and I think that's what we've managed to do so far. So it did come from the top down and kind of filtered through the ranks for the whole company. I think that was pretty effective, but I do think that the push to get it started beyond just the typical social clauses and labor clauses in contracts and all of that was that legislation, the SB 657.
Thank you. So it's very interesting for those of you who are not Americans and listening to this, how one state that has decided to, well, our biggest state, our most populous state, California, which is larger than many countries in the world, but once it takes legislative action, because it's such a large market, can force enormous changes in the business community and elsewhere. And that's a very interesting problem to think about, of how one region of a country can force change throughout the country. And so that's how local initiative can be very, very important. We want to thank you for your questions. If there are any final questions, please get them in, because we seem to be winding down. And it's been a great discussion. We're thankful for all of you participating, but let us know if there's anything else that you want to say before we conclude. Christina, do you have anything you want to add? Are you there, Christina?
I'm just unmuted. Thank you so much, Dr. Shelley. I just wanted to propose to you since we are academics and we're broadcasting this from an academic institution, in your opinion, what is the most effective way that academic institutions can really play a role in the fight against human trafficking and engaging with some of the practices and the promising practices of the private sector that we've talked about today, and also working with the NGO community, the activist community, and government to really make a dent in this issue? You've been researching this so long and so deep. What are your thoughts now on next steps for academia at this point?
I think there's a very central role for academia, because academia can be the honest broker. And as Alejandra was showing in Mexico, in many parts of the world, academia can be the moral leader in an area in which there's not as much going on in other sectors of the society, where Mexico has not had such an emphasis on civil society as the United States. So in the United States, we often have civil society as conveners, but in many parts of the world, it's very important to have academia be out there leading something where there's often not as many people to be involved in it. But I think research is really important, because today, as we talked about many questions, people were saying, we don't know this. And that's one thing that academia can do, is provide research. One of the things that I'm very concerned about, and I know Christina is, that we have bad research in this field. Sometimes we have extremely bad data on what is going on in human trafficking, either in sex trafficking and labor trafficking, and that, I think, does a real disservice to this phenomenon. And this is something where trained researchers, if they're in research-oriented think tanks or academia, can do. And academics can be important conveners, bringing together the different sectors of the community, because they are not ideologically driven. They're driven by a desire to understand the phenomenon, and in policy schools, they're interested in how to develop good policy. In business schools like yours, how to engage business. They're at the forefront of trying to find solutions. And they're also at the forefront of training the next generation that will be available and be able to think, help plan, and help implement. And, I've seen this, having worked on this issue for 2 decades, that some of the things I'm most proud of in my work are some of my former students who are taking national and international leadership positions in the field of human trafficking. So that's very, very important, I think. And we need to be, as academics, much more involved in this issue, and there are not that many centers in the world that are allowing people to focus on this. There are an increasing number of courses on it, which is a very recent phenomenon, but there needs to be much more structured ways to teach and engage people, also by having internships both home and abroad to help develop capacity. Are there any more things that you want to add, Christine, on what you see from a business school perspective?
Thank you, Dr. Shelley. That was really a great response and a thorough answer. And I just want to add a follow-up, because here at Babson College, we're very focused on entrepreneurship, education, and also looking at innovative solutions to the world's social problems. And we do that through all of our teaching methods and our action-oriented activities around the campus. And I just want to add a follow-up, and this would be for also Alejandra and Sarah. What are you seeing in your work in your respective sectors in terms of entrepreneurship and innovation? We have a lot of conversations around this campus about social impact research and how we're moving, in terms of corporate philanthropy and research grants into this area of social impact. And I know that, studying human trafficking and looking at human trafficking, and there are ways to address it from these entrepreneurial models. And I was really interested in hearing from Alejandra and Sarah, what are you seeing in your respective sectors in terms of this idea of entrepreneurship and using entrepreneurial methods to fight issues like human trafficking and engaging in social impact research from a corporation perspective? So Sarah and Alejandra, either one can go first.
I'll go first. So I briefly mentioned before that I think mobile technology is really the future of being able to collect this data from the people on the ground, and it's more than just for labor trafficking, but also for sex trafficking. If you've got a mobile phone and all you have to do is text, there's a lot of other things that go into it. You have to feel comfortable, you have to be trusting of the people you're texting and all of that. I think that's a really powerful tool. I had a discussion with a startup yesterday that is looking into doing things like this, where you don't need cell phone service, you don't need a Wi-Fi signal, you don't need any internet access. All you need is your mobile phone. It doesn't have to be a smartphone, and you can SMS or even tweet information on your farm, for example, or on a situation that you're in that you need help with, to the response line or to the data collection people. And I think that is crucial, because assuming that people are going to have internet access, or assuming that people are going to be able to get away from their situation to contact someone via a phone, a landline, or any other way is a little bit impractical. It's not typically the case. So I think that mobile technology is very important. I also think that the role of business in caring about these issues and becoming aware and talking about these issues is pretty important in disseminating this information to the main body of people out there who might not be aware of what's going on.
All right. We have one comment here that Grameen uses a technology for mobile phones called TaroWorks, and this might well fit well with what you're speaking of.
And I would like to just add that in our experience, the use of technology for addressing human trafficking, doesn't matter if it's sex trafficking or labor trafficking, could be a pretty interesting tool to collect data. However, working with direct victims of human trafficking, we know that we first have to empower these victims to understand that they have to complain about these issues, and that they have the possibility to access to safety conditions to do this kind of complaints using the cell phones or any other kind of internet tools or technological tools. They need to feel that they can do these kind of complaints, or they can use the cell phones or these technological tools to talk about the violations that they are suffering on safety conditions. Otherwise, as I already mentioned it in my presentation, the fear to be retaliate by complaining about the conditions that they are suffering, it is pretty high. And even when they have access to a cell phone or access to any other kind of technological mediums, they will be not able to inform and to give the data that academia and or other entrepreneurial activists can use to develop research on with social impact. So I think it will be pretty interesting if we can think in use the resources that we have to empower people that are under these conditions, and in our experience, that will be organizing them and also reach them with information about their rights and about the possibilities to complain with safety conditions.
Thank you so much, Alejandra, and I'll turn the floor over to Christina to announce when the next webinar will be. And thank you for being such loyal and devoted participants in this webinar, because I see that most of you who signed on in the morning are still with us at this moment, so thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shelley, and I want to just take a moment to just ask our panelists before I announce the next webinar, if you have any final comments or thoughts on the most effective ways that, we have a global audience who is listening to us this morning or this evening, depending on where you're located in the world, and what are the most effective ways that they can fight human trafficking from their respective sectors. We have a variety of people representing business, activism, government, policy, academia who are on the line. What are the most pressing things that they can do right now? And any other final thoughts or comments that you can make to conclude our webinar? And Dr. Shelley, why don't I just have it go back to you to start, and then we'll go to Sarah and Alejandra.
I don't have much more to add. The only thing I would say is that the more we can get diverse communities to work together and to build traction and support within the society and also internationally is crucial. That's why it's so wonderful to have the support of these diverse bodies that are participating in this webinar, and we need to broaden that base as well. Thank you.
Sarah, any final thoughts or comments?
So I do agree with Luis that diverse communities do need to work together to help tackle these issues. I do also, I guess this is from a grocery point of view, but also a consumer point of view, that I just want to point out that retailers will do what consumers ask for. And I do think that consumers have a lot of power with what they spend their money on. If we as consumers start demanding that our products are traceable and we can see all the way down to the farm level where they came from, and we know the people who made them either through some sort of certifications or some sort of transparency via that company or organization itself, I think that will speak volumes, and it might be even more powerful than federal legislation. These companies and businesses are only around because we pay them for goods and services. So if we're educated and we're aware and we care about these issues, we do have the power to make a change. I also think that we have to be willing to pay the price for those standards. So if we want our products made by people who have fair wages and good living conditions and are safe from harm and trafficking, we have to be willing to pay that price. We can't continue demanding extremely cheap items at all times of year, whenever we want, however we want them. There has to be a compromise. So I think that's an important point that I wanted to conclude with. And thank you for having me. It was really interesting discussion.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And Alejandra, any final thoughts, comments?
Yeah, I would like to just agree with the previous comments and to say that for Prodesk, it is essential to point out that recruiters cannot exist without companies willing to hire them for their services. And if businesses demand a higher level of behavior, the recruiters must comply or face extinction. So it will be important to have a more committed relationship with businesses that are trying to develop a more ethical approach to this problematic, as Safeway was already exposing during their presentation. And even businesses and consumers are an important part of the equation to build better access to justice to workers under this situation.
Thank you so much to everyone for your outstanding presentations and your work on this webinar. You are doing extraordinary work in the field to fight human trafficking, and on behalf of all of us, thank you for what you do every single day. We've had an amazing conversation this morning, and I want to thank all of our global audience members for participating and taking the time to have this conversation this morning. I think this is something that is so critical in terms of looking at how we can really make a dent in this space and looking at the most promising practices with the private sector, between public and private sector partnerships, and with the activist community. So thank you again, and I want to announce our next online webinar that we'll be having as part of this series, co-sponsored again with Babson College and the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime and the Terrorism, Transnational Crime, and Corruption Center at George Mason University. The title of the next webinar is Online Sexual Exploitation, Rights and Responsibilities, and we'll be talking about how we're seeing human trafficking and exploitation on the internet and the use of technology. And that is going to be on Wednesday, February 18th, 2015, from 10 o'clock a.m. to 12 o'clock p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And we'll be sending out more information on that, and we hope you can join us again for the next installment of this series. And with that, I want to send you on your way. And again, thank you for taking the time to sit with us this morning or this evening, depending on where you are in the world. All the best. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.